This week's topic is the classical era in music history. And that can be confusing, because weren't we talking about classical music in the Romantic era last week? In fact, we talk a lot about classical music in this course. The confusion comes from two different uses of the word classical. A lot of times when we talk about classical music, we mean classical in a generic sense, with a lowercase c, and this basically refers to music written without a drum set, especially the stuff written before the invention of jazz in the 20th century. But this week we're talking about classical music with an uppercase C, and it's a very specific period of time with a very specific style of writing. The Romantic period, with all of its overt emotionalism, was in many ways a reaction against the classical era, where elegance and restraint were prioritized. In the Romantic era, the harmonic language and the instrumental timbres and the extreme dynamic and volume contrasts were used to create strong emotional effects and to surprise listeners. In the classical era, most of that was avoided. More often, music was much more subtle. Maybe the music was clever or capricious, but it was never heavy or overbearing. As we know, the dates of these eras are a little fuzzy. Most people will say the classical era runs from about 1740 or 1750 through the beginning of the 19th century, when composers like Beethoven and Schubert started incorporating more romantic ideas into their music. Since we rounded the Romantic era to start at 1800, we'll round the classical era to end at 1800, and we'll take 1750 as a nice round number to begin it. You may remember that one of the hallmarks of the Romantic era was the idea of a long, flowing melody. By contrast, the elegance of the classical era was well articulated by short, balanced phrases. Oftentimes, these shorter phrases came in question and answer pairs called periods. There are two composers you really should remember from the classical era, and you've probably heard the name of the first one, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was an absolute genius. He was a child prodigy on tour and composing his own music by age 6. Mozart was certainly a larger-than-life character, and there are such incredible stories surrounding his life that sometimes it's hard to tell truth from fiction. For instance, the piece you're hearing now is called The Miserere by Gregorio Allegri. This piece used to be performed only in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome. Under pain of excommunication, it was not allowed to be performed anywhere else. You might ask, then, how is it that you are hearing a recording of it now? When Mozart was a teenager, he went to the Vatican, and he went to the Sistine Chapel and attended Mass there. He heard this piece, and the story goes that he transcribed it from memory and wrote it down so that everyone could hear it. This story actually turns out to be true. Some stories, however, are more fanciful. In 1830, Alexander Pushkin wrote a poem about a feud between Mozart and his contemporary Salieri. That poem was turned into an opera by Rimsky-Korsakov in 1897, and then into a play by Peter Shaffer in 1979. That play was turned into a movie in 1984, which won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Although Mozart and Salieri certainly knew each other, there was no actual rivalry between them as depicted in the movie. What the movie does get right, however, is the temperament of the characters. Remember, Mozart copied Allegri's Miserere, even though it was a highly prized secret of the Catholic Church. This kind of disrespect for authority was very characteristic of Mozart. Despite his lack of social graces, the aristocracy did put up with Mozart to some degree, simply because he was such a great composer. He could do things within the classical style of writing that no one else could do. For instance, let's compare this piano concerto by Mozart with one written by Salieri. Both of these pieces are written in the same form, in the same time period, and they follow the same patterns. I think, however, the difference in style between the two composers is striking. So Mozart could do things with the classical era patterns and forms that no one else could do. But where did these patterns and forms come from? The answer is Joseph Haydn. Haydn was probably the most famous composer of his era, and he was both Mozart and Beethoven's teacher. Many of his ideas are still popular today, and they certainly governed the composition of new music throughout the entire classical and Romantic eras. One of Haydn's most seminal developments was that of the symphony. The word sinfonia, or sometimes symphony, had been used previously to describe works for instruments without voices, but Haydn really codified what a symphony was and that definition persists to this day. In Haydn's model, a symphony was always a work for orchestra, including strings, woodwinds, and sometimes brass. It came in 4 movements. The first movement was always fast. The second movement was a slow, beautiful melody. The third movement was always based on a dance. And the last movement was a fast, exciting conclusion. The first movement was in a large form that we didn't discuss called sonata form. We didn't discuss it because it is long and complicated, and you probably don't need to know it for the purposes of a music appreciation class. But sonata form is one of the most important and influential innovations in all of Western music development. Remember when we were talking about ensembles, I said that there were any number of different chamber ensembles, that is, groups with only a few musicians, but unless you're told otherwise, chamber music really refers to the string quartet. Well, guess who came up with the idea of the string quartet? That's right, it was Joseph Haydn again. He defined the string quartet as 2 violins, viola, and cello, and then he wrote an extensive repertoire for that combination of instruments, which really solidified its place in history. So Haydn was really the innovator of the classical era. He's the one who set up the constructs that everyone else, including Mozart, followed. Music in the classical style of the late 18th century tends to be elegant and restrained. It's highly structured, built of short phrases, often grouped in periods. Contrasts in volume, harmony, and timbre are limited. Chamber music was very popular during this period. Symphonies and other larger works feature small orchestras with delicate instrumentation.